All right. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone is now coming on stream. Sorry, we're running a little bit late this morning. We just had a couple of technical difficulties, but I think we are good to go. So welcome, everyone. This is our regular Wednesday morning event series. We have Larry Marshall joining us from CSIRO. I'm Ian Gardner. I'm your regular host. I'm a co-founder at Innovation Bay. I'm also a VC. I'm an investment partner with Geeks Ventures. Always give a call out to the Innovation Bay team. So we got Faden Stow, my co-founder. Happy birthday yesterday, buddy. Shan, Claire, Sam, CJ, and Alison. So fantastic team. Delighted to have them all on board. And we're all working hard to support and connect you good folk on the line who are the startup community of Australia. Today, I'm coming to you from Queensland. We took the studio on the road. I've got a little, managed to get a winter break before the borders shut. So I'm up here having a great time with my beautiful wife. So yeah, thank you all for joining us this morning. For anyone that is not familiar with Innovation Bay, we are the longest running community for founders and investors across Australia. Our mission is to support you founders on journey from idea to IPO and beyond. And we do this through a range of events, programs, and content, all designed to enable people to connect, learn, and grow. So we've been doing this for quite a while. 2003 we started. We couldn't do this without our sponsors, so I do want to have a quick and a big thank you to these folks. So AWS, IAG, Farmark Ventures, Macquarie Bank, and KPMG High Growth Ventures. They do amazing work with the whole ecosystem and with us, and we really want to give a huge thank you to them. Short intro today, so I'm just going to stop my screen share and jump in so we can meet Larry. Larry, good morning.
Hey Ian, thanks for having me.
No problem. And now I'm going to take about 10 minutes here, it seems, to read your bio. It's going to be less than that, but you have a very long and distinguished bio. So I do want to just give a quick run through of that for everyone. So Larry Marshall is an Australian entrepreneur and physicist, and he's also the CEO of CSIRO, I'm sure we've all heard of. So CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. If you don't know it, it's Australia's national science agency and one of the most multidisciplinary agencies or research organisations in the world. CSIRO has a proud legacy of research, including Wi-Fi, Aerogard, polymer banknotes, and many others. Been going for around a century and pushing the boundaries of what's possible in science and technology. Larry's got a PhD in physics. He's a global leader in laser research. I'm not sure how much of that you've been doing recently, Larry, but you certainly have done a lot in the past. Honoured as a Federation Fellow and later as an Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering Fellow. You invented the eye-safe laser, which allowed lasers to be used safely in public. And that inspired you to start your first startup, Light Solutions, which went on to invent the world's first solid-state green laser for the treatment of blindness in diabetes. Larry's a serial entrepreneur who founded 5 other companies in biotech, telecoms, semiconductors, and in VC, venture capital. In 2007, you were MD of Southern Cross Ventures. You delivered the first NASDAQ IPO of an Australian venture-backed startup commercializing science. You've written over 100 publications and conference papers. You're the holder of 20 patents, and you've served on the board of 20 high-tech global companies. And you're still only 40. Is that right?
I wish.
So with this wealth of knowledge on innovation, today we're going to be discussing the role of science and tech transforming Australia's economy, energy, and environment. So yeah, look, thanks for joining us, Larry. You have spoken with us before. I think just after you got the job, you came along to one of our dinners. I don't think you had your ponytail at the time. I think you cut that off, if I remember.
Yeah, I've had the ponytail twice, but I cut it off at each IPO. Bankers don't like ponytails.
Right, interesting. All right, well, let's just jump straight into it. I mean, we'll start off with just the question that we kind of advertised this session on. So, I mean, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. It seems to be getting, insidiously worse. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, to even quote Donald Trump, who said that. It's been a health crisis, but it's, still to hit us, I think, economic crisis. It feels like we're a little bit in the eye of hurricane right now. I think there's some bad stuff that's going to be coming. But, I mean, what's the role of science and tech in helping Australia and the world recover from this global pandemic?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ian. And look, I guess it's two roles. One is because it's data and science that are kind of navigating our way through the crisis, figuring out where the hotspots are and where we need to lock down and where we can free up. And it's a balancing act, isn't it? Because you want to protect people, but at the same time you don't want to cause more damage economically by protecting them. So how can you use science and technology to do both? And the monitoring system that we created with UQ to look at wastewater to try and spot hotspots, track hotspots, and then focus mitigation areas there is one example of science and technology finding a way to kind of do the seemingly impossible, protect people, but also not derail the economy. And, Innovation Bay, you said it actually at our very first dinner, this whole concept that is so natural to entrepreneurs, see a different future, be a disruptor, see things differently, change the world. Scientists do that too. They love that, right? They love to invent stuff to change the world. The problem is they invent first and then try to figure out what to do with it later. So they do it backwards compared to entrepreneurs who actually, frankly, don't care that much about the science and tech, but they're trying to solve a problem. And I guess what I've been trying to do is get the National Science Agency more in the entrepreneur space. Yeah, we're all scientists and we all want to change the world, but what actual problems are we going to solve? And COVID is a fantastic example of that, where we're actually able to deliver solutions. So, CSIRO did, I think, the world's fastest animal trial for probably of the 80 vaccines. We ran 2 through record time of, normally it takes a year to do animal trials on a vaccine. We did it in less than 3 months. I don't think we could have done that if we didn't have a more entrepreneurial mindset. And now that's being tested in the US and the UK on human trials. So we may get to a vaccine quite quickly. There's no way you do that without science and tech.
Yeah. And what, do you think Australia is going to be the one that, do you think there is only one vaccine that will be discovered, or do you think it's going to be multiple?
No, look, and that's the other thing, again, in the innovation entrepreneurial journey, right? Invention is nothing. It's a brilliant thing. It's a paper, it's the front page of a magazine. But we all know as entrepreneurs, invention is like 1% of the effort to turn it into innovation. And we all know the hard part is actually making it real. So I'm not really that interested in who invented the vaccine. It's brilliant, it's great science, fantastic. But how do we make it, how do we get it to manufacturing? So probably 4 years ago, CSIRO realized that Australia didn't have the ability to scale up vaccine candidates. So we built a pilot plant in Clayton in Victoria that would be able to do that. And it took a few years to do, but that's the reason we're able to get on the front foot with the vaccine. So we've got all these candidates from all over the world, but a candidate is like a little tiny, a drop in a test tube. How do you scale it up to enough volume that you can test a few hundred animals? And then how do you scale it up to a few thousand doses to test humans? And then how do you manufacture it at scale for billions of people? Yeah. That's the hard part. The invention part, frankly, isn't that hard anymore.
Is that process the same for any vaccine, like that scale up? I mean, is it really the same facilities that you'd be using?
No, so that's the other challenge is there's different protein lines, different structures, different genomics to different vaccines. And so it's very hard. One company tends to produce one type of vaccine and they can't produce others. That's a challenge for us now because these 80 vaccines are all very different. So the other thing CSIRO has been working on, again, from about 4 years back, how do you make manufacturing naturally more agile so that you can make a high value product in good times, but rapidly retool to make a commodity that you might need, like a face mask, a surgical mask, because global supply chains dry up. How can you do both so you can make profit in good times and you can basically save lives in bad times? And we think that's the future of manufacturing, truly agile, ability to rapidly retool. And that's all enabled by science and technology. It's a different paradigm to you have a car factory to make cars and a tire factory to make tires. We think you can do a much more multifunction, agile sort of manufacturing capability.
So, I mean, in some ways, Larry, you've got the perfect background for both being a technology entrepreneur, but also running CSIRO. You know, because you have that blend of the science and technology expertise, but you've also, you know, got a highly commercial mindset that really understands how you should be thinking about commercializing that. So, I mean, you've gone on to take 3 companies now, I think, to IPOs, and I think all on NASDAQ. I mean, just can you give us some insight? You know, so you've got this VC founder experience, which is just amazing. You know, how are you using that within an organization like CSIRO to drive, you know, this new wave of innovation and commercialization across the org?
Yeah, and it was only 2 for me that I
only
found.
2, okay. I'm sure you've got another one in you.
Was Quantana, which was the first Aussie deep tech NASDAQ IPO. And it was Wi-Fi, but Wi-Fi on steroids. Quite amazing. And 20 years after the invention of Wi-Fi. So I'm really proud of that one, but I didn't found it. I just was the lead investor. So yeah, I think you said it actually. You know, I started my career like all scientists. I'm a physicist, you know, and I did a lot of inventing, but I kind of learned that lesson early on that if you don't actually deliver something from the invention, then you haven't really invented anything. It's like Al Gore inventing the internet. You know, we all know lots of people who invented the internet, but very few people actually made it work, and they're the ones who really, you know, built it, created it.
Yep.
So most scientists think innovation is invention, and we actually know that it's not. It's to be innovation, it has to create value. You have to put a product in someone's hands, and they have to value it enough to share some of the upside with you, and that's the virtuous cycle of innovation. So having gone through that, and you know, I didn't do an MBA, I didn't do any formal business training, but I tell you what, you know, you run 5 startups, you learn pretty quickly by trial and error what works and what doesn't. CSIRO for me was a chance to scale up. You know, the biggest company I'd ever run was about 300 people. How do you run a company with almost 10,000 in it, distributed across 57 sites? And you know, that wouldn't have worked for me if I hadn't been able to snag David Thodey as my chair, because David has run a big company around Telstra, and very different company, but very similar cultural challenge. So together we were able to, you know, the entrepreneur and the big company CEO, you put us together, we're a really great team to change a very big, you know, beloved organization. And so for me, very simply, it was genuinely be the role model that might inspire my scientists to actually think they could go on my journey, because their education tends to tell them they can't. Yeah. And society tends to tell them, no, you're a scientist, you're not a business person. And I'm trying to tell them, actually, you might be both. And the future will need you to be both. And so that's really kind of changed the way most of us think about what we do and how we do it.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the world's really great entrepreneurs are geeks. I mean, you think of Elon Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg and Jobs. I mean, they were pure geeks. I mean, they were all coding at some point in their life. So I think there is something in that. So,
you know, when Elon was at Stanford, right, he did PayPal because he had to, because they needed the money, but he never wavered from, I want to do a solar company, I want to do an electric car company, and I want to do something in space. And everyone thought he was nuts. But that's the hallmark of a great entrepreneur. People do think you're nuts because you think you can change the world, and sometimes you do.
Yeah, if it was obvious, everyone would do it. So that just, what's the current number? Like, how many scientists and researchers have you got now at CSIRO?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. We have about, well, it's between 8,000 and 10,000 people, depending on how you count it. Actual people on the payroll directly, about 5,500. Okay. Somewhere up to 1,400 students, a lot of people in industry and professors that spend part-time working in CSIRO, and we share them. And that's a change too, Ian, because we used to think of ourselves as a bricks and mortar institution. Now we think of ourselves as a network, and we really try to share more of our work with the broader system. And I think that's important, because that's how you start to create an actual ecosystem for innovation rather than a bunch of silos.
Yeah. I mean, I really want to ask about that, because I mean, that's a lot of people. Point one. Point two, I mean, they are scientists and researchers, and you know, I'm sure some of them are slightly awkward and some of them are out there. You know, when you joined, I mean, CSIRO has always had a fantastic reputation for just incredible research, but historically, I think in the years before you joined, it just, you know, I don't know whether this is unfair, but terrible way of commercializing it. how's it improved now? And can you give us some examples of some of the best recent commercialization projects you've been doing really in the last 10 years, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So CSIRO didn't have a bad track record for commercialization, but the problem was spin-outs and startups were a path of last resort. It was what you did if you couldn't do anything else with it. And that's true, I think, more broadly in the system as well. And equity wasn't seen as, you know, a lever or a vehicle. And so in the last 5 years, we've grown our equity portfolio about tenfold. It's probably the largest single source of funding, a tenfold increase in our science investment as well. So, and it's sort of shown our scientists that actually you don't need to complain about the government all the time. You can actually do something yourself that will generate revenue that will fund the science that you want to do. And so that's an important shift, because again, culturally, I think as scientists, we tend to say, oh, the public should fund this. And reality is, yeah, public should fund some, but industry should fund, or government should fund some, and industry should fund others. And that's how you know whether it's real innovation, whether someone's willing to pay for it. So tenfold increase in equity portfolio, which delivered more science, which is great. We've probably helped create about 50 startups in the last 4 years. And the thing that I really like, there's probably 90 SMEs out there that we injected very deliberately, pretty much life-changing technology that completely changed their business. And many examples I could give you of companies that couldn't break into global markets because they weren't differentiated enough. We're able to invent something, either a manufacturing process or a technology, that meant they were the only ones in the world that had it. And they lived that sort of startup experience of being the only provider of something that was really unique and high value. And that meant they grew big export markets. Some of them grew tenfold in their size, either market cap or number of people or both. And that's what really energizes CSIRO scientists, is seeing those companies grow.
Yeah.
Because the reason we exist is to try and make science real for, you know, societal benefit and economic benefit. And then more broadly, Australia is the lowest in the OECD for collaboration. It's pretty well known. We're pretty much at the bottom of the rung for commercialization. It's hard, and our culture doesn't really, you know, acknowledge that, I don't think. And you know, it's ironic because we're way up here at the top of the ladder on science. We're at the bottom of the ladder on commercialization, and obviously we need to shift that. The reason I came back to CSIRO is I think CSIRO could be one of the big catalysts to make that shift in culture. Then you asked me about the latest invention. So about 2 weeks into the COVID crisis, we were worried that Australia was going to run out of surgical masks, and you couldn't buy the masks because global supply chains had dried up, and you couldn't even buy the material in most cases. So we had to figure out a way, can you retool existing manufacturers and can you source a domestic material? Turns out that good old Aussie wool, if you engineer it properly, and it looks like a piece of wool, but it's actually a very high-tech piece of material that used machine learning, predictive analytics, polymer technology, and fiber technology from Aussie wool. But basically, the electrostatic properties of the wool, when combined with the polymer, suck the bacterial particles out of the air. And this is one of the most effective surgical mask filters that you could ever imagine. And we created it purely out of necessity because we thought there's no other way to get masks.
Yeah.
So it's a great story because it's science and existing companies like Textor in Victoria, jumping in together to the machine shop and the lab to try and solve a real problem. And if we could bottle that, we could bottle those things that we've done in COVID and carry them forward into good times, you know, I think we'd have an amazing innovation ecosystem.
Yeah. Like you touched on startups, you know, I want to make sure that we're talking about them. So you mentioned 50. I mean, 50 startups in the last 2 years that have come out. I mean, there's a couple of things that I think you've put in place since you're there. So the Accelerator, I think, was one of your initiatives, and Main Sequence Ventures has come along in the last couple of years. So Accelerator has been essentially defunded and gone away. So I mean, why did that happen? Like, maybe just give us some context to the Accelerator and some of the successes, and, you know, a glimpse into Main Sequence, if you could.
Yeah. So we did for that culture change that I mentioned, to try and really show the scientists how they could go down that path to build a business. And we piloted originally inside CSIRO, and then we gave it to the whole system, to all the universities and other publicly funded research groups. And we didn't expect a good financial outcome from ON. So that was a really big surprise to us, because it really was about teaching them, Steve Blank, Lean Launchpad, USI Corps. It was about teaching them that process. And what we found was they had lots of great inventions, but they didn't know actually how to commercialize it. So this is one that came out of ON. I don't know if you can see it. It's the world's first graphene-based water filter. And these guys figured out how to make graphene from soybeans. So
and graphene, for the uninitiated, can you give us a quick overview of graphene?
Yeah, so graphene's one of the hardest materials in the world. It's like carbon atoms in single layers. It's like diamonds, very, very strong, very tough. But they figured out a way to make it not expensively like diamond. So to make it a bit more real to use in things. The problem was they had no idea what to use it for. And so by going through ON, they were able to do this journey of discovery to find, the killer app for this particular thing was a water filter. Solves a big problem. Most water filters aren't very efficient. They're expensive. They take a long time. This thing really was a breakthrough. And I don't know if you saw them on Good Morning Australia drinking Sydney Harbour water after it had been filtered. You've got to really believe in your product to drink water out of any harbour. Sydney's pretty nice. But so, that's an example of the companies that we created by working together. And it wasn't just changing their culture. It was giving them access to everything inside the National Science Agency. And we did that with companies that came out of universities with ideas. We did that with Baraha, which is a completely separate startup doing autonomous vision. We let them move into Linfield, our old, dusty, Soviet-era looking bunker in Linfield. That's where I went as a student when I was inside CSIRO, actually. You wouldn't believe, there's 300 startup people inside that old building at one point. You wouldn't think that when you looked at it, because it looks like this dusty old science agency. But the reason they're there is, like Baraha learned, once you're inside, you can get access to all this stuff. The brilliant scientists, the amazing equipment. So they figured out their optical problems using our optics team. They figured out how to 3D print parts using our manufacturing team in Clayton. So they kind of tapped into the network. When they grew really big, and I think they're hundreds of people now, we needed them to move out, but they didn't want to leave CSIRO, so we had to find them another site. And so it's a great way to connect the startup community to the science agency. It's good for both of us because their innovation rubs off on our people, and able to access the brilliance of our people to help them do their innovation. So it's a good symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, and main sequence.
Yeah, and then so the idea was pretty simple. ON would go do the technology mining, find the things in the universities that were potentially investable, do this culture change and see how many entrepreneurs we really did have in the research sector. And then MSV would be able to fund the ones that really, crossed the hurdle, that were investable. And Ian, I'll tell you, we benchmarked to iCorps, which was the US version of ON. And it was the first one in the world, actually, and Steve Blank created it. What surprised us, because we weren't going for economic outcome, ON graduates typically raise 5 times more capital than iCorps graduates. The failure rate for ON is higher, but the success rate of the companies is almost 3 times what it is for iCorps. So it's a tougher funnel, but what comes out is far more investable. And the other really interesting thing, we had no diversity metrics on, and yet a disproportionate number of our CEOs and founders were women. And so there's really an untapped capability, I think, in our science sector, in women that we haven't really leveraged yet. Because we're 3 times higher diversity rate than iCorps, and with no intervention, it just naturally happened that way.
So maybe a little more color on main sequence. It's a $200 million initial fund, which CSIRO was the LP in. I think it wasn't just the only LP. I think some of the founding GPs, like Phil, Mike, Martin, and Co. I mean, they were also LPs, but it looks they've done 15-ish, maybe it's 20 now invest. I can't remember how big the portfolio is, but they must be about to raise another fund at some point, don't you think?
Yeah, so it's about 20 companies, and they're getting ready to go out again. We would have gone out, but for COVID, but right. Obviously a few other things we've been focused on. And yeah, CSIRO put in the first 30 million. The government put in another 70, and then we raised about 230. And SEC invested, Lockheed Martin invested from the US, and in big Aussie Super, really, they've been leaning into venture since we started Blackbird. But I was surprised that they were really so keen to jump into the CSIRO fund. And the reason I was surprised is our fund, it is a venture fund, but it's a venture fund with a catch. It has the same kind of criteria that CSIRO has. So we only invest in things that we think can really deliver national benefit. So not all startups will do that. Most will, but not all. And so it's a bit of a limitation. And a purist banker would say, well, then I'm not going to invest because I'm not going to get the maximum return. The super funds actually were really looking for kind of purpose-driven funds, because they really do want to kind of increase their ability to, benefit the ecosystem they live in. And I think that's a really important change. So we'll see more of that type of investment going into Australian venture and Australian startups from traditionally investors who they're a bit risk averse. So that's a nice change, I think, for the system. Yeah,
no, I think it's great. I love the thesis they've got and what they're looking at. Let me ask about culture. So, in some ways, this is a little, bit of a personal question too. I mean, Larry, you've kind of made it. I mean, you've probably got enough money not to have to work again. You got a house in the harbour in Sydney. Why did you want to go back to what seems like a fairly tough, bureaucratic, fairly political job? And what have you done to change the culture internally?
Yeah, thank God I don't have to deal with politics, right?
I'm sure you do.
I'd suck at that. So look, money was never really the driver for me. I kind of started out wondering whether I could even do it, and part of it was just proving it to myself that I could do that transition from scientist to business person. And the notion of an entrepreneur, I don't know what an entrepreneur was. Nothing in my education exposed me to that, but spending time at Stanford kind of fixed that. House on the harbour is nice, but especially after 26 years landlocked in Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley's got some great things, but a fantastic harbour is not really one of them.
Yeah, that's true.
Compared to Sydney. But, my startups were about using science to change the world. So, first eye-safe laser, so you could actually make lasers real. You could use them around people. The solid-state green laser, I can't tell you how many letters I still have from parents whose children we saved their eyesight or whose grandparents we saved their eyesight with that product. And that was the energy that fueled that startup. We did the first optical chip. Everyone knows about quantum computing. Probably fewer know about optical computing, but we made one of the world's first optical processor chips. And that thing, you could send an optical signal across the United States and it would arrive in the same condition as it left, which doesn't happen without some sort of intervention in this massively parallel processing. So look, we're all about the science. So we did it backwards too, in a sense. We invented stuff and then figured out what to do with it, which is what scientists do. But it was about, the breakthrough, changing the world, getting people to believe we could do it. And then the money was kind of a nice surprise. So if you look at it in that lens, there's no better place than CSIRO for me to be, because it's full of people that want to change the world. And if I can figure out how to enable them to do that, then we'll all be better off.
And any insights as to how you've gone about that cultural change? Because it must have been fairly tough.
Oh, mate, when you get on the front page of the New York Times, I think it's the first time we've ever been on the front page of the New York Times in a very negative way, then yeah, you can tell things are pretty tough. And look, there's a lot of negative media, there's a lot of crisis, that sort of thing. But human beings, we all have a speed limit for change. Entrepreneurs tend to have a much higher speed limit for change. And so I probably pushed the organization harder and faster than it was actually able to go. And so I had to learn to back off a little bit, do a different engagement style and try to move them. But I'll give you some stats because it'll make it clear. At one point we measure culture every year, staff surveys, that sort of thing. About 70% of our people support our strategy, our purpose, and our direction. There's about 90% support our purpose. CSIRO didn't have a clear purpose when I first started. It did way back, but it had kind of got muddled. And it didn't know whether it was about science or whether it was about industry, so it needed a bit of clarity. Today, so 70% of people support our strategy, 90% support our purpose. When we first started, it was about less than 30% supporting strategy and a lot of confusion around purpose. 30% actually is pretty much the all-time high, and that's typical of science agencies because scientists don't agree on things. So it's amazing to me that we're able to move it that far in a few years. But it took a bit for them to understand that, you know, I wasn't there to, you know, monetize their science. I wasn't there to do evil political things to them. I was there to try and help them figure out what their purpose was and then how to deliver it. CSIRO's purpose, really simple: solve Australia's greatest challenges using science and tech. What are they? What are the challenges? Nobody knew. So we spent, like any good startup, we spent the first year mapping out what are the roadmaps for each of our industries. What about emissions? What about climate change? What about environmental issues? We mapped them out the way you would in a startup and picked the points where we thought we could fundamentally disrupt the future, and we focused our science on that. That's how we got things like the hydrogen breakthrough, how we were able to do these, you know, 50 startups and fundamentally change 90 SMEs. It's how we did things like the wool for face masks or the graphene water filter. And they look back on that now and realize, actually, yeah, science really made a difference for the country. And I think that's why they feel much better about the purpose and the strategy. And now they're really focused on how do we navigate out of COVID. And all of the stuff that we did the last 5 years is, I think, fundamental to how we create economic value for the country to get out of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, no, that's good insight. And I love the fact you're using data to support. I mean, that's in some ways a cultural norm that you've probably changed, just, you know, using data to support the cultural change you've had. All right, there's a few questions coming in from the audience. So audience, keep them coming. Do encourage it. I think you can either put them in the chat or in the Q&A box down below. So there's one in from Zarmeen Parvi. What role do you see for deep tech and its application within climate change or climate action? And there's been a bunch on climate action, so let's maybe kick off with this one.
Yeah, all right. So I recently appointed a young female postdoc to run our climate centre. And postdocs are early career researchers generally, and she took the role because she was part of the whole climate crisis in CSIRO in 2016. And she was pulled out of climate science and put into agriculture, which she hated. And she decided she was going to teach the farming community why climate change was real, because most farmers didn't believe it. And she discovered during that journey of discovery that actually climate change isn't relevant to most farmers because Australia's climate variability in any given year dwarfs climate. So long story short, she realized that she had to reframe her climate science to make it relevant to agriculture. And then she created an app called Graincast. Now, Jackie didn't know how to code, but she learned that through On and other things we did. And she created this app, which is now used broadly across Australia by farmers to predict the impacts of climate change in a way that's very specific to them. So how many seeds should I buy? How much yield can I expect this year? How much water and fertilizer will I need? And how do I optimize my economic outcome despite climate change? And so she had that realization that actually, it's not they don't believe in it, it's that the way we were presenting it wasn't relevant to them. So she had to kind of re-prosecute the science. We did the same thing with Future Feed. So the cattle industry resists climate change because they're afraid it's going to hurt their business. Cattle are the world's third biggest source of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, after China and the US. If cattle were a country, they'd be number 3. We invented a thing called Future Feed, which essentially eliminates the emissions from cattle when you feed it to them. Now, the cattle community resisted it originally because what are you doing messing with our feed? Until they discovered it's about the same cost, but you get a bit more nutrition, so you can get the beast developed a bit quicker. So it's a bit better for your business, but it's really good for the bottom line of the planet. And again, then the resistance went away because we came to them with a solution rather than saying, oh, you're causing climate change. Hydrogen was the same thing. You know, yeah, we'd love to get out of producing coal and LNG, but we don't want to dig a 180 billion hole in our economy. So is there something else can science invent something that can fill that hole? And we think when you do that, you get rid of the politics of climate change and you come up with solutions. And that's what entrepreneurs and innovators do.
And what did you call the climate centre? Like, can you tell us a bit more about that? What this place, or is it a place?
We created it, and it's a bit different to the usual CSIRO model. So the climate centre is a collaboration. We house it, we created it, but University of Tasmania, University of New South Wales, a number of unis actually work with it. The Bureau Met work with it. The UK Met Office work with it, and China actually works with it. So Australia has the best model for climate of the Southern Hemisphere, but there are others who have a better model for the Northern Hemisphere. We put them together, we can map the world for climate, and you can't solve a global problem if you don't collaborate globally. Yep. So its purpose is to very specifically figure out how we can do a better job of predicting seasonal and decadal climate effects, because then we can predict droughts in Australia, floods in China and Asia. And that's really important to protect our people, equally to protect our economy.
Yeah. All right, let's keep rolling with some more questions. Another startup question from Emma LaRusso. Hey, Emma, what should our government be doing to support and promote startups and early growth companies?
Emma, I know the spirit of your question is good, but I'm always surprised, and maybe it's too long in Silicon Valley, but I'm always surprised when I hear entrepreneurs saying the government should do more to help. Because as an entrepreneur, I never thought the government would help. I thought they might get in the way, but I never thought they would help. And yet in Australia,
sometimes getting out the way is helping. I mean, it's, you don't. It's not like here's free money. It's just sometimes here's a visa regime is better, or whatever.
No. And I guess what surprised me, the R&D tax credit, I love that thing. What a great way to get capital for a startup. So I think there's a few levers the government can pull. And the big one for me, in the US, the US government did a thing called the Small Business Innovation Grant. And it's essentially a way if the government needs something developed, it's a way they can help incentivize the startup community to go build something new that they will buy. And I know our government has been piloting that. I think that's a good example of where government can help. But the R&D tax credit, I think, is the big one, because it's real money in your hand if you're trying to commercialize using R&D.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going. There's another question from Steve Milanowski. What are the core functions of CSIRO at the new aerotropolis? Not sure where that is, but and how are they going to relate to a space-based economy? So I guess a question around space.
Yeah. So CSIRO is one of the biggest users of space data in the country, and we do NASA's telemetry and we do the European Space Agency's telemetry, because they do the northern half of the universe and we do the southern half. And by the way, the southern half is the interesting place because it looks straight into the center of the galaxy. So we tend to get all the action down here, which is kind of nice. So Australia's in a good place for space. Aerotropolis, I can't tell you the names of the other companies that are going there, but because of who they are and where they come from, they're really instrumental in leveraging their channels to the global space market. So that will be good, and it will be very much about space. But I think it's an opportunity to do more of what I said we did at Linfield, where we open ourselves up to the local entrepreneurial community, even to the point of having them work on our sites alongside our scientists. I think there's an opportunity for Western Sydney to really get an injection of innovation, and that's probably the overarching strategic reason we wanted to go there. That's probably it, because we have a great hub in ATP, where we have one of our big nodes of Data 61. We have another great hub in Melbourne for digital. So digital, I think we got covered pretty well in those two hubs. But the Linfield, Marsfield, North Ryde sites, they aren't quite in the right place to really tap into a big community of people there. So it's an opportunity to get more, I think, from that.
Yeah. And is there competition? That's probably the wrong word, but I mean, you've got the Australian Space Agency, you've got the South Australian government's got its own sort of space group that it's looking at, and I think CSIRO is now playing some role. So, I mean, how do you play nice with everyone else?
Oh yeah, so we helped create the space agency. We loaned a number of our people to Megan when she was setting it up. Megan used to run CSIRO, so we've a very good relationship. We helped do the roadmap for them. The space agency won't be like NASA. It's a different role to NASA, but they're doing a great job, I think, of leveraging people who are. CSIRO's been in space for 70 years. So they're doing a good job of leveraging us, our capability, our people to help them fulfill their mission. And it's a good example of being a network rather than being a siloed institution. And I think our future is about networks.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Let's take a few more questions. Belinda Chu, what's your view on the Australian IPO market, especially for tech-focused companies looking to fund global growth?
Yeah. So I think the ASX is an untapped resource that people for years were afraid of IPOing if they were tech companies. They always had their sights set on Silicon Valley. And that was right then. I think the problem with Silicon Valley and NASDAQ and more broadly the US market, after the global financial crisis, SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance drove the cost of going public up, dramatically. So, when we took Iridex public, it was a few $1 million of cost. Today it's more like 10, 12, $15 million because of all the legal compliance, risk, all the other stuff that got, the government piled on regulatory compliance to companies that, normally find it hard to carry that burden. So you went from a threshold of IPO where you might need 50 million or 100 million in revenue. Now you need 200, 300, 400 million in revenue to go public. So that shifted the market more to the big end of town. ASX doesn't have that huge compliance burden, and so smaller companies can go public sooner, raise more capital in a public market, and then kind of grow into their market cap. So I think the ASX is a good, potentially an unfair advantage that Australia has.
But I think the question is maybe specifically around the deeper tech things, because you think about the companies that have listed, and I'm not picking any in particular, but Kogan, Wise Tech. I mean, they're basic. I mean, they're obviously not basic companies, but there's no real deep tech behind them. It's not SpaceX or
yeah.
Like
okay. Sorry. So I'm passionate about the ASX. Well, I'm passionate about unfair advantages for Australia. So I've always been passionate about the ASX as a potential unfair advantage. So myself and my co-founder took a company public on the ASX to kind of prove that you could do a tech IPO, and it was a Silicon Valley company that we IPO'd on the ASX, and that company it roughly tripled in share price. We grew it from 5 million to 35 million to 115 million in revenue. So it delivered really strongly. So we're well on the way of proving that you could do it. And it was a very technical company. It was doing next gen communication systems in China for the Beijing Olympics. And it, as I said, created a lot of revenue, created a lot of value, and kind of got investors because you're right, there wasn't a market maker in technology, deep tech. And so what we found though was there's a lot of willingness on the part of the big funds to dedicate people to learn our market, to learn our technology and actually make a market. So it was going really well until we hit the global financial crisis. And probably 5 years after I left, the company got into real trouble. And unfortunately, Australia's got two things. So everyone loved the tripling the share price, but they didn't like 5 years later that it got into trouble and had the GFC. So we've got to get I think, a bit more mature in how we handle global financial crises, because Australia felt like it didn't get affected by the global financial crisis. But if you were in a tech company in global markets, you got absolutely crushed.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of maturity needed there. But I think the first part still rings true. There's a willingness in the market, if you can find the right market makers and the right analysts, they do want to learn the tech market.
Yeah,
I think that's an untapped opportunity for us.
Yeah, just for what it's worth, I totally agree with you on the ASX. I think it is slightly unearthed gem. I mean, it's a lighter regulatory touch. You're seeing US companies IPO here, like Life 360 and a few others have come down here to do just that. And whether or not it's tech, I don't know whether it really matters. I mean, ultimately, it's a path towards gaining capital to grow your startup. So if you've got a great business that's commercializing, go and raise your money there, use that money to fuel growth, and then the financial results should speak for themselves. So I think it's still a good place to do it. All right, here's another question from Matt Perry, and this sort of taps into your US experience. So, I mean, you saw in the US, relationships between commercial, like business, and academia. Are we doing it as well here between business and academia? I mean, you've obviously got the CSIRO experience, and you've touched on some of the other institutions. How are we doing here in that axis?
Yeah, let me have a go at this, and just bear with me. If you think of science innovation kind of linearly, so you go from TRL 0 to TRL 10. TRL 0, is invention, an idea, and TRL 10 is a hardcore product in industry. So, and imagine it's a bit of a fuel gauge from 0 to 10. So I think our universities are at fairly low TRL. But universities all over the world are at fairly low TRL as well. And they might be a little bit better than we are. So Stanford, MIT, maybe a little bit better at tapping into industry than our universities. But it's not meaningful. They're still down here in this low TRL. And they have to be there because that's their job, that's their role. If they're not there, we're not getting amazing breakthrough science. We're not getting inspired students, brilliant students, and we're not in the top 10 of the world's education systems. So they are where they have to be for a really good reason, and they're not materially different to the US. If you look at what the government does to change that, there's things called CRCs, Cooperative Research Centres, and they easily make Australian unis equal to US unis in terms of their commercialisation if you add them to the mix. And CSIRO, part of CSIRO's role is to do that too. So I think we get in a pretty good place. The problem is we're still down here, which is where we have to be, but it's the same in the rest of the world. And then go to the company end. So US companies lean far more into startup land. They go far more into risk land. But European companies, not so much. Rest of the world companies, not so much. So if Australian companies are here, like risk averse and not wanting to go too far, and the rest of the world's here, I'd argue that the R&D tax credit plugs the gap. I think the R&D tax credit pulls more across. And yeah, there's more you could do. But if you think of that analogy, we're just tweaking at the edges. We're not really playing in the valley of death. We're not really dealing with the core problem. And that's where I've really tried to push CSIRO to, how do we get more SME? So Australia has something like 4% of our SMEs or our companies do new to world innovation, 4%. In Canada, same size, same resources-based economy, it's 40%. How do we get 4%? How do we turn 4% into 40%? The Canadian government used the National Research Council, their version of CSIRO. They leveraged that vehicle to really drive change. They created a fund, they created some entrepreneur programs, they created maker labs. So we're doing, I think, a similar thing to what Canada did. We didn't copy Canada. We kind of realized all this looking back and learning on what had worked for us and sharing that with our global peers. But their observation is actually, here's what worked for us, maybe it'll work for you. So I think that's where we need to focus. And Ian, that's the reason your group is so important, because you live in that ecosystem. You live in that sort of valley of death place where no one quite knows how to navigate. Your Silicon Valley doesn't have this problem because they've filled that gap with a a really vibrant ecosystem. But if you can be successful, if we can be successful creating that ecosystem, then I reckon we'll fill that gap. For sure, the government can help us, but they can't do it. We can do it. And I think that's why I want to stay connected with you, because together we really can do it.
Yeah, no, completely agree, and appreciate your compliments there. Right, it's we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, so let's see if we can get through a few more. Yeah, there's a few around career choices. So there's a question from Maxwell Hayward, another one from Catherine Ennis. Any advice for young students who haven't decided what they want to do for a career? You know, if you're, heading down the academic path, should you do that, or a business path? Like any insights for the world nowadays?
Yeah, so I would firstly erase the idea of separation between business and academia. So Wall Street employs more physicists than almost anywhere else I know. And most of those physicists didn't study physics to go do analytics or be quants on Wall Street. But it turns out that physicists and astronomers are fantastic at doing that kind of financial analysis.
It turns out they also like money.
It turns out they like money. Yeah. So the thing is, your career, you will have probably 20 careers in your life, and you will change frequently. You know, one of the bankers that I pitched to in my first IPO said, "What's wrong with you? Can't you hold a job? You keep changing careers." Because I moved through 5 markets, and that was very natural for me as a scientist to want to do that. But today that will be the norm. You will naturally do that. So in terms of your education, you've got to have STEM skills. You don't necessarily need to know how to code, although that would help. But you need to have an agile mind. You need to have an innovative mind. So you need those STEM skills, and you need to think differently. And for God's sake, don't say business versus science or business versus academia, because they're going to blur. The boundaries are porous. They're going to merge. Yeah. And then be open to change. The reason I started each company, I mentioned, change the world, but it was driven by a frustration that people couldn't see what I could see. And I think Elon Musk or it might have been the other founder in PayPal, the startup, the Founders Fund guy, might have said it. The uncomfortable truth that you can see that no one else can see is that's the seed that creates disruption, the seed that creates startups. And you shouldn't be afraid because you see a different future to everyone else. You should embrace that and go try and make that happen.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if we can churn through a couple more in the last 2 minutes. One from Paul Hawkins. He says he's from Crazy Might Work. I don't know whether that's his company or just the way he thinks. How should entrepreneurs connect with CSIRO for science acceleration? So is there a good way for the startups out there to work with CSIRO?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So we have these maker labs in various places. So at Clayton Lab 22, at Linfield, we'll have one at the Aerotropolis. There's a bit of one in ATP in Redfern, where we do most of our digital work next to the bank. But if you reach out to us, you can shoot me an email, you can shoot my team an email. We can connect you. But there's a number of programs where CSIRO will help you tap into Department of Industry funding programs to help you fund some of your science and research. There's other programs that'll help you crack really wicked problems. And sometimes it's just a matter of you working in one of our labs for a while to get access to some of our equipment or our people to solve the problem yourself. And that's our ideal space, by the way, because we want you to do more research in your company so that ultimately you'll employ more Australian graduates so that we'll build up an ecosystem of our own here. Yeah. So if we can help you on your way to grow, then that's good. That's good for all of us.
All right, that's a good tip. All right, last question, Larry. So your contract or your tenure has been extended another 3 years, I think. What are you hoping for CSIRO in that 3-year period? And are you going to grow your ponytail once again?
I only grew my ponytails for IPOs and only cut them off for IPOs.
No, you really don't care. So you just do it, you know, bring that new culture in.
Yeah,
Ponytails are back.
So look, I don't think any leader could leave in the middle of COVID. And so I might have moved on, if not for COVID. But I do have a couple more things I really want to deliver in CSIRO. So CSIRO has never created its own CEO from inside. And I'd really like to nurture my successor and have them grow from within CSIRO. I think that'd be really important. That'd show we'd really reached a maturity of our leadership, our people, our culture, if we could produce our own CEO. So that would be one. I really want CSIRO to deliver a couple of big industries. So we're pushing hard on hydrogen. We're pushing really hard on agriculture. We want to see if Australia can grow from 60 billion to 100 billion in revenue from agriculture. And there's a couple of really nasty roadblocks like counterfeiting. You know, something like the majority of Angus beef steaks that are sold in Asia that are represented as being from Australia aren't. And if we can crack that, that's easy money for growing the Australian market. So there's a few things like that I really want to deliver. And then just the culture shift. If we really can look back and say, here's the things we delivered to get Australia out of the COVID financial crisis, I think then the needle will be hard set in culture. And I won't have to worry that if I leave, it'll drift back, because they'll have lived the innovation experience in one of the worst crises the world's ever seen. If I can lock that culture, then I think I can move on and be satisfied. Worst thing is the CEO who doesn't know when to leave, by the way. All CEOs leave. We all have a finite lifetime, and we come in fresh and full of ideas. But if we're not careful, we become part of the problem.
Yeah.
Mess. So you really got to leave before that happens and go on and do something else.
I think there's a lesson in that for everyone. Larry, we are out of time, so thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I always enjoy having a chat with you. I feel like we should sit down and have a beer sometime, which we never get a chance to do, but we'll take you up on that one day. So look, thank you, and thanks for answering everyone's questions. I'm just going to quickly jump to share my screen again. I'm sure you don't want to see. Hang on, let me minimize the questions I was looking at. Just quickly, we're doing this next week. We have Right Click Capital, Tidal Ventures, and Tempus Partners who are doing a VC Ask Me Anything. So that should be quite interesting. So it's all about you as the audience. It's a constant theme. Everyone wants to know how to raise money and some of the pitfalls that might be on the way. So we have that coming up. We came out with another Open the Pod Bay Doors. We just did our news special. Minimize me. So we had Billy Tucker, Gavin Appel, and Melissa Widner. That I managed to bash that out a couple of days ago from the Queensland holiday location. So I really enjoyed that. Some good insights there as well. That is it. So thank you again to our sponsors, AWS, Farmark Ventures, KPMG High Growth Ventures, and Macquarie Bank. So Larry, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you, audience, as well. So we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Faden. Take care and be safe.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.